In the quiet shadows of history, there are moments when the world exhales after holding its breath for too long. The spring of 1945 was such a moment. As Allied forces swept across a shattered Germany and atomic fire descended upon Japan, humanity stood at a threshold between one age and another. The guns fell silent, the rubble began to cool, and in that strange, uncertain peace, the victors looked around and realized that winning the war had been the simple part. Understanding what came next would prove infinitely more complex. Among the artifacts of that great conflict was an organization that had operated largely in shadow, the Office of Strategic Services, known simply as the OSS. Created in 1942 under the leadership of William Wild Bill Donovan, a Medal of Honor recipient and Wall Street lawyer. The OSS had been America's first coordinated intelligence agency. Its operatives had parachuted behind enemy lines, sabotaged Nazi supply chains, and gathered secrets from occupied territories. They had been cowboys and scholars, safecrackers and professors, united by a singular purpose: to outwit the Axis powers through information and deception. Yet as the autumn leaves fell in 1945, President Harry Truman made a decision that sent shockwaves through America's nascent intelligence community. With a stroke of his pen on October 1st, he dissolved the OSS. The reasoning seemed sound on the surface. America had always been wary of maintaining a secret police force in peacetime. The nation had won its war. Surely now it could return to the comfortable innocence of isolation, protected by two vast oceans and the atomic monopoly that seemed, at least for the moment, unassailable. But history, as it often does, had other plans brewing beneath the surface of apparent calm. Even as OSS personnel packed their files and said their goodbyes, perceptive minds recognized what was coming. The wartime alliance with the Soviet Union, always an uneasy marriage of convenience, began to fracture with alarming speed. In the smoking ruins of Europe, two incompatible visions of the future faced each other across an emerging divide. Winston Churchill would soon speak of an iron curtain descending across the continent, but the reality of that division was already becoming apparent to those who paid attention to the whispers in the corridors of power. The American military establishment found itself suddenly blind. The OSS had built networks, cultivated sources, and developed expertise that simply evaporated with its dissolution. Army and Navy intelligence units competed jealously with one another, hoarding information rather than sharing it. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover's iron grip, focused primarily on domestic threats and guarded its territory with bureaucratic ferocity. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence services, the NKVD, and its successors operated with ruthless efficiency, their networks already deeply embedded in Western governments, scientific institutions, and military establishments. The period between late 1945 and 1947 became a strange interregnum, a twilight time when America's leaders slowly awakened to a new reality. Reports filtered in from Europe. The Soviets were consolidating control over Eastern Europe, installing puppet governments, and silencing opposition with brutal efficiency. In Greece, communist insurgents threatened to topple the government. In Turkey, Stalin demanded territorial concessions. In China, Mao's forces were gaining ground against the nationalists. The world had not become safer with peace. It had merely exchanged one set of dangers for another, and this new threat operated not with tanks and bombers, but with ideology, subversion, and secrets. Within the halls of the Pentagon and the State Department, a debate raged about what form America's response should take. Some former OSS officers found temporary homes in the War Department's Strategic Services Unit, keeping the flame of centralized intelligence alive. Others dispersed into civilian life, carrying with them the knowledge that what had been dissolved would eventually need to be rebuilt, perhaps in a different form, but certainly with greater permanence and broader authority. There was a growing recognition, uncomfortable for a nation that prided itself on transparency and democratic values, that the coming struggle would require tools that operated in darkness. The The Soviet Union had no qualms about using every means at its disposal: espionage, propaganda, assassination, subversion. To compete in this new arena, America would need to build something it had never truly possessed before: a permanent, professional, centralized intelligence service capable of operating globally, continuously and in complete secrecy. The question was no longer whether such an organization was necessary, but rather what form it should take, what powers it should possess, and how to reconcile its existence with the democratic principles it was meant to defend. As the calendar pages turned through 1946 and into 1947, the architecture of America's Cold War posture began to take shape. The urgency was palpable among those who understood the stakes. George Kennan's long telegram from Moscow in February 1946 had crystallized the threat. The Soviet Union was not a potential partner for peace, but an ideological adversary committed to the eventual triumph of communism worldwide. This was not a problem that could be solved with armies alone. It required a new kind of warfare, psychological, economic, covert, and new institutions to wage it. President Truman, a man who had come to office unprepared for the complexities of global leadership, found himself shepherding the most comprehensive reorganization of American national security apparatus in the nation's history. The National Security Act of 1947, signed into law on July 26th of that year, would fundamentally reshape how America projected power and gathered intelligence. It unified the armed services under a single Department of Defense, created the National Security Council to coordinate policy, established the Air Force as an independent service, and buried within its provisions, almost as an afterthought in the public discussion, it authorized the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA's birth certificate, if we can call it that, arrived officially on September 18, 1947, when Rear Admiral Roscoe H. Hillenkoetter became its first director. The agency absorbed personnel and functions from various predecessor organizations: the Central Intelligence Group, which had served as an interim solution, and remnants of the OSS scattered across military intelligence units. But this new organization was intended to be something different, something more enduring and more powerful than what had come before. The language of the National Security Act laid out the CIA's charter with deliberate vagueness that would prove both blessing and curse. The agency was tasked with coordinating the intelligence activities of various government departments, correlating and evaluating intelligence relating to national security, and here was the phrase that would later justify so much, performing such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security, as the National Security Council may from time to time direct. Those final words, such other functions and duties, became the elastic clause that would stretch to encompass operations that the Act's authors likely never imagined, or perhaps deliberately chose not to specify. It was in that bureaucratic ambiguity that the seeds of the CIA's future as not merely an intelligence-gathering agency, but an instrument of covert action were planted. The public understanding was that America now had an organization to collect and analyze information. The classified reality, understood by only a few, was that the nation had created a tool for shaping events in the shadows. The early CIA was a modest affair by later standards. Its headquarters occupied a collection of temporary buildings scattered around Washington, with its nerve center in a series of interconnected Quonset huts near the Lincoln Memorial. The personnel numbered in the hundreds rather than thousands, many of them OSS veterans who had kept the faith during the lean years, believing that their country would eventually realize it needed them again. They brought with them not just skills and experience, but a certain swashbuckling spirit, a sense that they were the enlightened, few who understood the real nature of the struggle ahead. The CIA's initial mandate was primarily analytical, to serve as a central clearinghouse where intelligence from military services, the FBI, and State Department could be collated, assessed, and presented to policymakers in usable form. The morning intelligence briefing to the President which would become one of the agency's most important daily rituals, began in these early days. It represented something revolutionary, a dedicated flow of information, stripped of service rivalries and bureaucratic agendas, delivered directly to the nation's ultimate decision-maker. Yet even in these formative months, the agency began to venture beyond pure analysis. In December 1947, just 3 months after its official establishment, the National Security Council issued Directive NSC-4A, authorizing the CIA to conduct covert psychological operations abroad. The following year, NSC-10-2 would expand these authorities dramatically, creating the Office of Policy Coordination to conduct covert operations including economic warfare, sabotage, and support for anti-communist resistance movements behind the Iron Curtain. The transformation from intelligence service to action agency had begun, though few outside the classified world understood what was happening. To the American public, the CIA remained a vague and somewhat mysterious organization, necessary perhaps, but operating at the margins of policy. The truth, already emerging in those foundational years, was that the agency would become a central instrument of American power in the Cold War, a secret army answerable only to the president, capable of influencing events from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the halls of European parliaments, from the deserts of the Middle East to the back alleys of Latin American capitals. And so it began, this grand experiment in democracy maintaining a secret service. Born from the ashes of the OSS, forged in the dawning chill of the Cold War, the CIA entered history as both promise and paradox, an organization meant to protect American values by operating beyond the constraints those values imposed, a guardian that would grow powerful enough to become, in some eyes, a threat of its own. The story of what would unfold over the decades to come would test the boundaries of that paradox again and again. There is something deeply paradoxical about building an organization designed to remain invisible. In those first years after its creation, the Central Intelligence Agency faced a challenge that few institutions in American history had confronted: how to construct a bureaucracy powerful enough to influence global events while maintaining the secrecy necessary for its operations to succeed. The answer would emerge through trial, error, and the personalities of men who believed they were building something essential to their nation's survival. The agency's early structure reflected the tensions inherent in its dual mission. On one side stood the Directorate of Intelligence, populated by analysts, scholars, and researchers who saw their role as providing objective assessment of global threats. These were the men and women who pored over Soviet industrial production figures, studied military deployments through reconnaissance photographs, and attempted to divine Kremlin intentions from the cryptic pronouncements of communist officials. They worked in offices that could have belonged to any government research institution, their weapons nothing more dangerous than slide rules and typewriters. On the other side, growing more powerful with each passing month, stood the covert operators. Initially organized under the Office of Special Operations and later consolidated into the Directorate of Plans, these were the spiritual descendants of Wild Bill Donovan's OSS operatives. They recruited agents in foreign capitals, planned operations that would never appear in any public record, and operated under the conviction that the Cold War would be won or lost, not in open battle, but in 1,000 secret contests fought in darkness. The cultural divide between the analysts and the operators would become one of the agency's defining characteristics, sometimes creative, often contentious. At the helm during these formative years stood a succession of directors struggling to define what this new agency should become. Admiral Hillenkoetter, the first director, was a competent naval officer but found himself overmatched by the bureaucratic warfare of Washington and the operational demands of global intelligence. His tenure, though brief, established important precedents: the President's daily brief, liaison relationships with foreign intelligence services, and the basic administrative framework that would support the agency's growth. But it was the arrival of Walter Beadle Smith as director in October 1950 that truly began to forge the CIA into the formidable institution it would become. Beadle Smith, as he was universally known, had been Eisenhower's chief of staff during World War II, a man known for his volcanic temper, his organizational genius, and his absolute intolerance for incompetence. He brought military discipline to the agency's chaos, expanded its budget and personnel dramatically, and insisted on professional standards that transformed what had been a collection of individualistic adventurers into something resembling a coherent organization. The recruitment of personnel during these years tells its own story about what the CIA was becoming. The agency drew heavily from America's elite universities, the Ivy League schools that would later be derided as nurseries for the establishment. Yale, Harvard, and Princeton produced a steady stream of recruits, often tapped through subtle approaches by professors who were themselves former intelligence officers. These young men, and they were almost exclusively men in these early years, came from families of privilege, spoke multiple languages, and possessed the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having questioned one's place in the world. They believed, often with touching naivete, that they were joining a noble enterprise, serving their country in a new kind of warfare where intelligence and cunning mattered more than brute force. Meanwhile, the agency began to build its operational capacity abroad. Station chiefs took up residence in American embassies around the world, working under diplomatic cover while running networks of agents and informants. In the divided city of Berlin, CIA officers tunneled beneath Soviet-controlled territory to tap communication lines. In the mountains of Eastern Europe, they attempted to support anti-communist resistance fighters, dropping weapons and radios to partisans who believed American help would be forthcoming if they rose against their Soviet masters. Most of these operations failed, often tragically, as the CIA learned hard lessons about the penetration of its networks by Soviet and Eastern European intelligence services. The agency also began to develop relationships with figures who would later haunt America's conscience. In Europe, former Nazi intelligence officers were recruited for their knowledge of Soviet operations, their crimes rationalized or ignored in the urgency of the new conflict. In Asia, nationalist movements and warlords received CIA support based on their anti-communist credentials rather than any democratic principles. The moral compromises began early, driven by the conviction that the Soviet threat justified almost any means necessary to contain it. Perhaps most significantly, these early years saw the CIA begin to develop capabilities that went far beyond traditional intelligence gathering. Technical services divisions worked on everything from invisible inks to poison pills. The agency explored psychological warfare, propaganda, and what would later be called perception management. Research programs investigated the possibilities of mind control and pharmaceutical interrogation, work that would eventually metastasize into the notorious MKUltra program. The tools of influence were being forged, each one justified by the exigencies of the Cold War, each one pushing the boundaries of what a democratic society's intelligence service should do. By 1950, the CIA had evolved from a paper organization into a functioning instrument of American power, with thousands of employees, stations around the world, and a budget that dwarfed its modest beginnings. The question was no longer whether America would have a central intelligence agency, but rather what that agency would become and what it would be willing to do in the name of national security. On a summer morning in June 1950, North Korean forces poured across the 38th parallel, and the Central Intelligence Agency received its first great test. The invasion caught American policymakers by surprise, a failure that would reverberate through the intelligence community and accelerate the CIA's transformation from an analytical organization into an operational weapon. The Korean War would become the crucible in which the agency's covert action capabilities were tempered and refined, often through painful lessons written in the blood of agents whose names would never be publicly known. The initial intelligence failure regarding North Korea's intentions represented a fundamental problem that would haunt the CIA throughout the Cold War. The difficulty of penetrating closed societies where information flowed only through channels controlled by totalitarian states. The agency had possessed scattered reports of military buildups along the border, but these were dismissed or lost in the noise of competing assessments. When Kim Il-sung's Soviet-equipped divisions crashed south, supported by tanks and aircraft, the surprise was nearly total. President Truman demanded answers, and the CIA found itself on the defensive, scrambling to prove its value even as American forces retreated down the Korean peninsula. Yet beneath this strategic failure, the agency began to demonstrate capabilities that would define its role in the Cold War. As conventional forces fought desperately to hold the Pusan perimeter, CIA operatives deployed into the chaos to gather intelligence, recruit agents, and prepare for operations behind enemy lines. The war provided opportunities that peacetime never could. Permission to take risks, conduct experiments, and develop techniques that would have been impossible to justify in calmer circumstances. The agency established a forward base in Japan, from which it launched a series of covert operations into North Korea and later into China. Teams of agents, many of them Korean exiles or Chinese nationalists, were infiltrated by parachute, boat, and overland routes. Their missions ranged from intelligence gathering to sabotage, from organizing resistance networks to simply surviving long enough to report on enemy movements. The casualty rate was horrific. Many teams disappeared without trace, captured by North Korean security forces or betrayed by double agents. Those who were caught faced torture and execution, their deaths unknown to all but a few CIA officers who had sent them. One operation stands out for its audacity and its tragedy. In the autumn of 1952, the CIA attempted to establish a resistance network in northern North Korea, dropping teams of agents equipped with radios, weapons, and gold to buy support. The operation was compromised from the start. North Korean intelligence had penetrated the exile community in South Korea, turning potential agents into instruments of deception. The teams walked into ambushes, their radio messages back to handlers, carefully orchestrated by their captors. The CIA, eager for success stories to justify its budget and autonomy, took longer than it should have to recognize the deception. By the time the truth became clear, dozens of agents were dead, and the agency had learned a bitter lesson about the difficulty of running operations in hostile territory. Yet the Korean War also brought successes that validated the CIA's role. The agency's analysts correctly predicted Chinese intervention in October 1950, though their warnings were dismissed by General MacArthur and his intelligence chief. When Chinese forces crashed across the Yalu River in massive human waves, catching American forces unprepared for the onslaught, the CIA's assessment was vindicated. This success strengthened the agency's position in Washington's intelligence community, giving it credibility that would prove crucial in future bureaucratic battles. The war also saw the CIA pioneer techniques that would become standard in later conflicts. Aerial reconnaissance flights over North Korea and China, initially conducted by modified bombers and later by dedicated intelligence aircraft, provided invaluable information about enemy dispositions. The agency worked with military counterparts to develop tactical intelligence systems, integrating signals intercepts with human intelligence to build a clearer picture of enemy intentions. Interrogation facilities in South Korea processed thousands of prisoners, extracting information while also serving as laboratories for psychological techniques that would later be refined and, in some cases, abused. Perhaps most significantly, Korea accelerated the CIA's involvement in paramilitary operations, the gray zone between intelligence gathering and conventional warfare. The agency organized guerrilla units on islands off the North Korean coast, launching raids against coastal installations and attempting to tie down enemy forces. It worked with special operations units to conduct sabotage missions deep behind enemy lines. These experiences would inform the agency's later adventures in Southeast Asia, where the line between intelligence operations and actual warfare would become increasingly blurred. The armistice signed in July 1953 left Korea divided and the war unresolved, but the CIA emerged from the conflict transformed. It had proven, at least to the satisfaction of its advocates, that covert operations could influence events in ways that conventional forces could not. The agency had built an infrastructure for paramilitary operations, developed relationships with foreign intelligence services, and earned the confidence of policymakers who saw in its capabilities a tool for fighting the Cold War without risking open confrontation with the Soviet Union. As veterans of the Korean conflict returned to CIA headquarters, they brought with them lessons that would shape the agency's future. They had learned the value of compartmentalization, the necessity of operational security, and the brutal reality that intelligence work often demanded sacrifices from people who would never be honored publicly for their service. They had also learned that success in covert operations required not just courage and cunning, but political support in Washington and a willingness to accept failures that could never be explained to the public. The CIA was no longer simply an intelligence agency. It had become an instrument of American foreign policy, capable of operating in the shadows to advance interests that could not be pursued in the light. In the ancient land of Persia, where empires had risen and fallen for millennia, the Central Intelligence Agency was about to write a new chapter in the art of covert regime change. The year was 1953, and in Tehran, a democratically elected prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh had committed what Western powers considered an unforgivable sin. He had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company, seizing control of his nation's petroleum wealth from British hands. What followed would become a template for CIA operations around the world, a blueprint for toppling governments without firing a shot, at least not obviously, and a case study in the hubris that comes from early, seemingly easy success. Mossadegh was not a communist, nor was he particularly anti-American. He was a nationalist, educated in Europe, who believed that Iran's oil belonged to Iran. For decades, the Anglo-Iranian oil company had extracted vast wealth from Persian fields while paying the Iranian government a pittance in royalties. When Mossadegh moved to rectify this imbalance in 1951, he sparked a crisis that would draw the CIA into its first successful coup d'etat. The British, humiliated and financially wounded by the nationalization, lobbied Washington furiously for help. Initially, the Truman administration resisted, uncomfortable with overthrowing an elected government. But when Eisenhower took office in January 1953, bringing with him the Dulles brothers, John Foster, as Secretary of State and Allen as CIA Director, the calculation changed. The Dulles brothers saw the world through a Cold War lens so tinted that any nationalism, any challenge to Western interests appeared as a potential opening for Soviet expansion. They convinced Eisenhower that Mossadegh, however democratic his credentials, was leading Iran toward chaos that the communists would exploit. The Iranian Two-Day Party, aligned with Moscow, provided the fig leaf of justification. In reality, the decision to overthrow Mossadegh had less to do with communism and more to do with oil, Western economic interests, and the demonstration of American power in a region already emerging as strategically vital. The operation, codenamed T-Page-Axe by the CIA and Operation Boot by the British, was placed under the direction of Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, and an OSS veteran who embodied the patrician adventurism of the early CIA. Roosevelt arrived in Tehran and began orchestrating a campaign that combined propaganda, bribery, and manufactured unrest. The CIA pumped money to Iranian politicians, military officers, newspaper editors, and street thugs. Agents provocateurs posed as communists, staging demonstrations and riots designed to frighten Iran's middle class and religious establishment. False documents portrayed Mossadegh as a Soviet puppet. The agency recruited clerics and bazaar merchants, paying them to denounce the prime minister from pulpits and market squares. The first attempt at a coup on August 15th failed spectacularly. Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a young monarch whose nerve failed at the crucial moment, fled to Rome. Mossadegh's supporters filled the streets in celebration, believing they had defeated the conspiracy. But Roosevelt refused to accept defeat. With remarkable audacity and limited authorization from Washington, he decided to try again. Over the following days, he mobilized his paid agents, coordinated with Iranian military officers, and staged a second wave of orchestrated chaos. On August 19th, crowds that appeared spontaneous but were actually CIA-orchestrated marched through Tehran, joined by military units whose loyalty had been purchased. By day's end, Mossadegh's residence was overrun. The Prime Minister was arrested, and the Shah was telegraphed to return. The operation cost approximately $1 million and resulted in the death of several hundred Iranians in the street fighting. To the CIA, these were acceptable costs for a resounding success. The Shah returned to his throne, grateful and compliant. Iran's oil industry was reorganized, with American companies receiving a 40% share. Most importantly, from the agency's perspective, the United States had demonstrated its ability to shape events in the Middle East through covert action. Roosevelt returned to Washington a hero, his operation studied and celebrated within the intelligence community as a masterpiece of low-cost, high-impact intervention. Yet beneath this triumph lurked seeds that would germinate into catastrophe a quarter-century later. The coup destroyed Iran's nascent democracy, eliminating the parliamentary system and independent political parties that had been developing. The Shah, restored by American power, would rule with increasing autocracy, his secret police SAVAK trained and supported by the CIA, his regime a symbol of Western interference in Iranian affairs. The resentment this generated would simmer for decades, feeding the revolutionary movement that would eventually overthrow the Shah in 1979 and bring to power an Islamic Republic virulently anti-American. But in 1953, such consequences lay beyond the visible horizon. The CIA had proven that regime change was possible, that governments could be toppled without massive military intervention, that a combination of money, propaganda, and carefully orchestrated chaos could reshape the political landscape of entire nations. The success in Iran would embolden the agency to attempt similar operations elsewhere, convinced that the formula could be replicated. The next test would come swiftly, in a banana republic thousands of miles away, where American corporate interests and Cold War paranoia would again combine to justify covert intervention. If Iran had been the CIA's proof of concept, Guatemala would be its confirmation that the model could be exported across continents and cultures. In the spring of 1954, the agency turned its attention to a small Central American nation where a reformist government threatened the comfortable arrangement between American business interests and local oligarchs. What unfolded in Guatemala that year would establish patterns that would repeat across Latin America for decades. The conflation of reform with communism, the use of covert action to overthrow elected governments, and the installation of military regimes that would rule with brutal efficiency in the name of anti-communism. Jacobo Arbenz Guzman had come to power through legitimate elections in 1951, the second president in Guatemala's brief democratic spring, following decades of dictatorship. He was a military officer turned reformer who believed his country's desperate poverty could only be addressed through land redistribution. Guatemala's economy was dominated by the United Fruit Company, an American corporation that owned vast plantations, controlled the railroad system, and operated the country's only Caribbean port. The company paid minimal taxes, left much of its land uncultivated, and exercised influence over Guatemalan politics that resembled colonial rule more than business partnership. Arbenz's agrarian reform law, passed in 1952, aimed to expropriate unused land and distribute it to landless peasants, with compensation based on the value the landowners themselves had declared for tax purposes. The law affected United Fruit dramatically, threatening to redistribute much of the company's holdings. In response, United Fruit launched a sophisticated lobbying campaign in Washington, painting Arbenz not as a reformer, but as a communist threat to American interests in the hemisphere. The company had powerful allies. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had been a legal counsel to United Fruit. His brother Allen Dulles, now CIA director, had served on the company's board. President Eisenhower's personal secretary was married to United Fruit's public relations director. The lines between corporate interest and national security became hopelessly blurred. The Dulles brothers convinced Eisenhower that Guatemala was becoming a Soviet beachhead in the Western Hemisphere, though the evidence was thin. Arbenz did have communist advisors, and Guatemala's small communist party supported his reforms, but there was no evidence of Soviet control or even significant influence. Nevertheless, in August 1953, Eisenhower authorized Operation PB Success, and the CIA began planning its second coup in as many years. The operation followed the Iranian playbook but added elements that would become standard in later interventions. The agency established a training camp in Nicaragua, where Guatemalan exiles were organized into an army of liberation under Carlos Castillo Armas, a former military officer willing to serve as the face of the coup. This force, numbering only a few hundred men, was never intended to actually defeat Guatemala's military in battle. Instead, it served as theater, a prop in a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare designed to create the illusion of a massive uprising. The CIA created a clandestine radio station, the Voice of Liberation, which broadcast from neighboring Honduras, spreading disinformation about the strength of rebel forces and calling for defections from Arbenz's military. Agency aircraft, flown by American pilots, conducted bombing runs over Guatemala City, dropping leaflets and occasionally explosives to create panic. The attacks were militarily insignificant but psychologically devastating, particularly when one bomb struck near a military parade, convincing Guatemala's officer corps that the United States was fully committed to Arbenz's overthrow. The actual invasion, when it came in June 1954, was almost farcical in its military incompetence. Castillo Armas's ragtag force crossed the Honduran border and advanced a few miles into Guatemala before stalling, outnumbered, and outgunned by government forces. But military reality mattered less than perception. The CIA's propaganda machine created the impression of a large-scale uprising. American diplomats pressured the United Nations and Organization of American States to avoid intervention. Most crucially, the agency worked to convince Guatemala's military leadership that resistance was futile, that the United States would not allow Arbenz to survive, and that their own survival depended on abandoning the president. The psychological pressure worked. On June 27th, with his military wavering and American threats mounting, Arbenz resigned and fled into exile. He would spend the rest of his life wandering from country to country, a broken man who had dared to challenge American power. Castillo Armas entered Guatemala City in triumph and established a military dictatorship that would last decades, reversing land reforms, crushing labor unions, and initiating a cycle of violence that would eventually claim over 200,000 lives in Guatemala's brutal civil war. For the CIA, Guatemala was another unqualified success. The operation had cost approximately $5 million and no American lives. It had removed a government viewed as threatening to U.S. interests and demonstrated American resolve in the hemisphere. The agency's reputation soared, its budget and authority expanded. Allen Dulles became perhaps the most powerful intelligence chief in American history, reporting directly to a president who increasingly relied on covert operations as a tool of foreign policy. Yet the true costs of Guatemala would only become apparent over time. The coup destroyed Guatemala's democracy and inaugurated decades of military rule marked by massacres, disappearances, and genocidal campaigns against indigenous populations. It sent a message throughout Latin America that reform would be equated with communism and met with American intervention. It convinced a generation of Latin American revolutionaries that peaceful change was impossible, that armed struggle was the only path to justice. Among those taking note was a young Argentine doctor named Ernesto Che Guevara, present in Guatemala City during the coup, who drew conclusions that would shape his revolutionary career. The CIA had won another victory, but it was sowing whirlwinds it would reap for decades to come. As the 1950s drew to a close, the Central Intelligence Agency found itself operating at the cutting edge of technology, quite literally at the edge of space. The U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, developed in secret by Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works division, represented a quantum leap in intelligence gathering, a plane that could fly at 70,000 feet above the reach of Soviet fighters and missiles, photographing vast swathes of Soviet territory with cameras of extraordinary resolution. For 4 years, these missions had provided the United States with unprecedented insight into Soviet military capabilities. But on May 1, 1960, one of these flights would end in disaster that would embarrass the CIA, derail a superpower summit, and demonstrate the limits of technological superiority. The U-2 program had been Alan Dulles' pet project, a response to the desperate need for reliable intelligence about Soviet strategic capabilities. Throughout the 1950s, American policymakers had operated in a fog of uncertainty about the USSR's nuclear arsenal and military strength. Wild estimates circulated about Soviet bomber production, the famous bomber gap. And by the late 1950s, fears of a missile gap dominated defense debates. The U-2 was meant to pierce this uncertainty, to provide hard photographic evidence of what the Soviets actually possessed rather than what worst-case scenarios imagined. The aircraft itself was a marvel of engineering, designed by Clarence Kelly Johnson to be essentially a powered glider with a jet engine, long wings for high-altitude flight, minimal weight, maximum range. It was also remarkably fragile. Pilots joked that it was the only aircraft that could be brought down by turbulence. To fly at such extreme altitudes required specially selected pilots who underwent rigorous training and wore pressure suits similar to those of astronauts. The CIA recruited military pilots, sheep-dipped them into civilian status to provide plausible deniability, and sent them on missions that were among the most dangerous and secret of the Cold War. From bases in Pakistan, Turkey, and Norway, U-2s penetrated deep into Soviet airspace, their cameras capturing images of military installations, missile sites, and industrial complexes. The intelligence was extraordinary. The U-2 photographs revealed that Soviet bomber production was far less extensive than feared, debunking the bomber gap. They provided precise locations of missile sites and nuclear facilities. They even captured evidence that helped intelligence analysts understand Soviet technological capabilities and industrial capacity. For President Eisenhower, who obsessed over the dangers of miscalculation in the nuclear age, the U-2 represented a way to make informed decisions rather than guessing at Soviet capabilities. But Eisenhower also understood the risks. Every U-2 flight was a violation of Soviet sovereignty, an act that would be considered an act of war if discovered. The Soviets knew the flights were occurring, their radar tracked the planes, but lacked the ability to shoot them down. This frustrated Soviet leaders enormously, particularly Nikita Khrushchev, who viewed the overflights as deliberate humiliation. Soviet air defenses worked frantically to develop missiles capable of reaching the U-2's operating altitude. It was a race between American espionage and Soviet technology, and in the spring of 1960, Soviet technology caught up. Francis Gary Powers, a 30-year-old pilot from Virginia, took off from Peshawar, Pakistan, on May the 1st for a mission designated Operation Grand Slam. His flight path would take him across Soviet Central Asia over sensitive missile facilities at Tyuratam and Sverdlovsk before landing in Norway, a distance of nearly 3,000 miles, much of it over the most heavily defended airspace in the world. Unknown to Powers or his CIA handlers, the Soviets had tracked U-2 flights for years and had prepared a trap. As Powers flew over Sverdlovsk, a salvo of SA-2 surface-to-air missiles rose toward him. One exploded close enough to tear off part of the plane's tail. Powers lost control and was forced to bail out, parachuting into Soviet territory where he was immediately captured. The CIA's cover story that this was a weather research plane that had strayed off course collapsed within days when Khrushchev gleefully revealed that Powers was alive and had confessed to espionage. Worse, the Soviets recovered the largely intact wreckage of the plane, including its sophisticated cameras and undeveloped film. For Eisenhower, it was a nightmare scenario. First, he authorized lying about the mission. Then, when the lie was exposed, he was forced to admit that the United States had been conducting espionage flights for years. The humiliation was complete. The diplomatic fallout was severe. A summit meeting in Paris between Eisenhower and Khrushchev, which had raised hopes for easing Cold War tensions, collapsed before it truly began. Khrushchev used the U-2 incident to grandstand, demanding an apology that Eisenhower refused to give. The brief thaw in superpower relations froze over again. Powers was tried in Moscow, sentenced to 10 years, and eventually exchanged in 1962 for Soviet spy Rudolf Abel in a prisoner swap on Berlin's Glienicke Bridge. For the CIA, the U-2 incident represented a painful lesson in the limits of technological solutions and the dangers of overconfidence. The agency had grown accustomed to operating with impunity, conducting operations that pushed or crossed the boundaries of international law. The U-2 shootdown demonstrated that technological advantages were temporary, that luck eventually runs out, and that when covert operations fail publicly, the political costs can be devastating. Yet even as the U-2 program was curtailed, the CIA was already developing its replacement, the SR-71 Blackbird, and eventually reconnaissance satellites, continuing the technological arms race that would characterize intelligence gathering throughout the Cold War. The game had changed, but the CIA's fundamental mission remained constant: to gather secrets by any means necessary, whatever the risks, whatever the costs. There are moments in history when hubris collides with reality, and the resulting wreckage teaches lessons that echo through decades. For the Central Intelligence Agency, such a moment came on the beaches of Cuba in April 1961, when an invasion force of exile fighters waded ashore at a place called Playa Girón, known to the world as the Bay of Pigs. What unfolded over the following 72 hours would become the agency's most spectacular and humiliating failure, a disaster so complete that it would force a fundamental reckoning with the limits of covert action and the dangers of believing one's own propaganda. The roots of the debacle stretched back to January 1959, when Fidel Castro's revolutionary forces swept into Havana, overthrowing the dictator Fulgencio Batista. Initially, American policymakers were uncertain about Castro. He was clearly a nationalist and a radical, but was he a communist? That question became moot as Castro began nationalizing American businesses, executing Batista supporters and moving closer to the Soviet Union. By early 1960, the Eisenhower administration had authorized the CIA to begin planning Castro's overthrow, and the agency, flush with confidence from its successes in Iran and Guatemala, embraced the mission with enthusiasm. The plan that emerged bore the familiar hallmarks of previous operations. An exile force would invade Cuba, sparking a general uprising against Castro while American involvement remained plausibly deniable. The CIA established training camps in Guatemala where Cuban exiles, many of them former Batista supporters or middle-class refugees, were transformed into Brigade 2506. The agency provided weapons, aircraft, and instructors, building an invasion force of approximately 1,400 men. The planners promised that once the brigade established a beachhead, anti-Castro Cubans would rise in revolt, Castro's military would defect, and Cuba would be liberated with minimal American involvement. Every assumption underlying this plan was fundamentally flawed. But the CIA's leadership, particularly Richard Bissell, the brilliant but arrogant deputy director for plans, refused to acknowledge the growing evidence that the operation was doomed. Intelligence reports indicated that Castro's regime was far more popular and his security apparatus far more effective than the planners assumed. The Cuban exile community was riddled with Castro's informants. The invasion plans were an open secret in Miami. Most critically, the notion that a small exile force could spark a general uprising ignored the reality that Castro had already arrested or executed most potential opposition leaders and maintained iron control over the island. When John F. Kennedy took office in January 1961, he inherited the invasion plan and faced immediate pressure to approve it. The CIA assured him success was likely. Military advisors who had reviewed the plan were more skeptical, but were overruled. Kennedy, only months into his presidency and eager to appear tough on communism, approved the operation with one critical modification. He refused to authorize American air support, insisting that U.S. involvement must remain covert. This decision would doom whatever slim chances the invasion had, but the CIA planners, confident in their own expertise, pushed forward. The operation began to unravel before the first exiles set foot on Cuban soil. A preliminary airstrike meant to destroy Castro's air force on the ground was only partially successful. Several Cuban aircraft survived. When Brigade 2506 landed at the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961, they found not a population ready to rise in revolt, but a well-prepared defense. Castro, forewarned by his intelligence service, had positioned militia units around the landing site and personally directed the counterattack. The surviving Cuban aircraft, which the CIA had promised would be eliminated, strafed the invasion beaches and sank supply ships, leaving the brigade without ammunition or reinforcements. The exiles fought with courage born of desperation, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. Requests for American air support went unanswered. Kennedy, confronted with the reality that the operation was failing and unwilling to commit U.S. forces openly, refused to escalate. For 3 days, the brigade held out on the beaches and in the swamps, waiting for help that never came. By April 19th, it was over. More than 100 exiles were dead, nearly 200 were captured, and the survivors faced show trials and imprisonment. The promised uprising had never materialized. Castro's regime emerged stronger, and the United States stood exposed as having attempted and failed to overthrow a neighboring government. The Bay of Pigs was a catastrophe on every level. Strategically, it strengthened Castro's position, drove him deeper into the Soviet embrace, and provided him with a propaganda victory that he would exploit for decades. Diplomatically, it humiliated the United States before the world, confirming Latin American suspicions about American imperialism. For the CIA, it was an institutional trauma that exposed the dangers of groupthink, overconfidence, and inadequate planning. Kennedy, who publicly took responsibility for the failure, privately seethed at the agency that had assured him of success. In the aftermath, Kennedy fired Allen Dulles, the legendary spy master who had led the CIA through its greatest triumphs and now its greatest failure. Richard Bissell, architect of both the U-2 and the Bay of Pigs, resigned in disgrace. The agency underwent painful reforms, and Kennedy vowed that he would never again trust the CIA's assurances without independent verification. Yet even as the agency licked its wounds, forces were already in motion that would give the CIA a chance at partial redemption, a crisis that would bring the world to the brink of nuclear war and demonstrate that intelligence, when accurate and properly used, could be worth more than entire armies. "18 months after the humiliation of the Bay of Pigs, the Central Intelligence Agency found itself at the center of the most dangerous crisis in human history, a 13-day period in October 1962 when the world balanced on the edge of nuclear annihilation. This time, the agency's performance would be measured not in covert operations gone wrong, but in its ability to provide accurate intelligence under immense pressure, to give policymakers the information they needed to navigate between appeasement and apocalypse. The Cuban Missile Crisis would offer the CIA a measure of redemption, demonstrating that intelligence gathering, the agency's original core mission, remained more vital than any covert action scheme. The crisis had its roots in the very failure at the Bay of Pigs that had so damaged the CIA's reputation. Castro, convinced that the United States would attempt another invasion, pleaded with the Soviet Union for protection. Nikita Khrushchev, seeking to offset American nuclear superiority and America's missiles in Turkey near Soviet borders, saw an opportunity. He would secretly install medium and intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Cuba, creating a strategic threat that would deter American aggression while dramatically shifting the nuclear balance of power. The operation, conducted with elaborate deception measures, began in summer 1962 as Soviet ships transported missiles, launch equipment, and thousands of military personnel across the Atlantic. Throughout the summer, the CIA received disturbing reports from Cuban refugees and agents on the island about unusual Soviet activity, large shipments arriving at Cuban ports, extensive construction in remote areas, restrictions on Cuban access to certain installations. The agency's analysts debated what this activity meant. The consensus view, shared by most of the intelligence community, was that the Soviets were installing defensive surface-to-air missiles and conventional military equipment, significant but not game-changing. The possibility that Khrushchev would be reckless enough to place offensive nuclear missiles in Cuba seemed unlikely. It violated Soviet doctrine and risked direct confrontation with the United States. But a few analysts were unconvinced. They noted peculiarities in the construction patterns, the configuration of sites, and the security measures that suggested something more than defensive installations. They pushed for increased surveillance, particularly high-altitude U-2 reconnaissance flights that had been curtailed after the Gary Powers incident. Throughout September, bureaucratic caution and poor weather delayed the flights that might have discovered the truth earlier. It was not until October 14, 1962, that a U-2 piloted by Major Richard Heiser flew over western Cuba and captured photographs. That would change everything. The images from Heiser's flight reached CIA photo interpreters at the National Photographic Interpretation Center the next day. Working through the night with stereoscopic viewers and enormous magnification, these specialists, artists of imagery analysis whose skill approached the mystical, identified telltale patterns in the photographs, launch positions, support equipment, missile transporters, all matching Soviet medium-range ballistic missile installations. By the morning of October 16th, the CIA's assessment was definitive. The Soviets were installing nuclear-capable missiles in Cuba that could strike much of the eastern United States with little warning. The agency briefed Kennedy that morning, showing him the photographs and explaining their significance. The president stared at the images in silence, understanding that the crisis he had feared since the Bay of Pigs had arrived. What followed were 13 days that tested not just the CIA, but the entire American national security apparatus. The agency's role during the crisis was primarily to provide continuous intelligence updates, flying U-2 missions daily despite the risk. One U-2 was shot down over Cuba on October 27th, killing pilot Rudolf Anderson and working frantically to assess Soviet capabilities and intentions. How many missiles were in Cuba? Were they operational? Were nuclear warheads present on the island? These questions had life or death implications for millions of people. The CIA's analysis during the crisis was imperfect, but generally accurate where it mattered most. The agency correctly identified the missile sites and tracked their construction progress. It provided Kennedy and his advisors with detailed assessments of Soviet force deployments. Crucially, it offered evidence that while the missiles were being installed rapidly, they were not yet fully operational, giving Kennedy a narrow window to respond before facing operational nuclear missiles 90 miles from Florida. This intelligence gave the president options beyond immediate military action, allowing him to impose a naval blockade called a quarantine to avoid the legal implications of blockade as an act of war while pursuing diplomatic solutions. The agency's intelligence also revealed what would only be learned years later. The situation was even more dangerous than Kennedy's advisors believed. The CIA correctly identified most missile sites, but missed some tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba. Agency analysts underestimated the number of Soviet troops on the island, believing there were about 10,000 when in fact there were over 40,000. Most critically, no one in Washington knew that Soviet commanders in Cuba had tactical nuclear weapons, and some authorization to use them if communications with Moscow were cut. Had Kennedy ordered the military invasion that many advisors urged, it might have triggered a nuclear exchange that would have killed millions. But what the CIA did provide, accurate information about strategic missiles, clear photographic evidence, and continuous monitoring, gave Kennedy the knowledge he needed to navigate between the equally catastrophic options of backing down or starting World War III when Khrushchev finally agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove US missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended with both sides stepping back from the abyss. For the CIA, the missile crisis was a qualified success that restored some of the prestige lost at the Bay of Pigs. The agency had done what intelligence services are supposed to do: discover threats, provide accurate assessments, and give policymakers the information needed to make informed decisions. Yet the crisis also revealed troubling limitations. The CIA had initially missed the missile deployment and had been slow to recognize its significance. The agency's human intelligence inside Cuba was limited. Most crucial intelligence came from technical means, the U-2 flights and signals intelligence, rather than from agents. These lessons would shape the agency's future priorities, driving investments in satellite reconnaissance and signals intelligence, even as the covert action side of the house continued to expand in other theaters, particularly in a small Southeast Asian nation where the CIA was already deeply and increasingly tragically involved. As one chapter of the Cold War threatened nuclear apocalypse in the Caribbean, another was unfolding in the jungles and rice paddies of Southeast Asia, where the Central Intelligence Agency became entangled in what would become America's longest and most controversial war. Vietnam was not a single CIA operation, but a 20-year descent into a quagmire where the lines between intelligence gathering, covert action, and actual warfare became so blurred that they effectively disappeared. The agency's involvement in Southeast Asia would produce some of its most controversial programs, inflict deep moral wounds, and ultimately demonstrate that even the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus cannot manufacture victory from flawed strategy and corrupt allies. The CIA's engagement with Vietnam began in the mid-1950s after the French colonial defeat at Dien Bien Phu and the Geneva Accords that temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Colonel Edward Lansdale, a legendary CIA operative who had helped defeat a communist insurgency in the Philippines, arrived in Saigon in 1954 with a mandate to build South Vietnam into a viable anti-communist state. Lansdale was a true believer in counterinsurgency, convinced that winning hearts and minds mattered more than military force. He found in Ngo Dinh Diem, the Catholic Mandarin chosen to lead South Vietnam, a client who shared his anti-communist fervor, if not his understanding of political legitimacy. The early CIA operations in Vietnam mixed idealism with manipulation. Agency personnel helped organize propaganda campaigns, trained Diem's security forces, and conducted sabotage operations in North Vietnam designed to weaken Ho Chi Minh's regime. The agency promoted Diem internationally while quietly helping him consolidate power by suppressing opposition, often through brutal means. When Diem's government faced religious and political protests, the CIA provided advice on how to manage dissent, advice that Diem interpreted as license for increasingly authoritarian rule. By the early 1960s, the regime the CIA had helped build was corrupt, repressive, and losing the support of South Vietnam's peasant population. As the situation deteriorated, the CIA expanded operations beyond Vietnam into neighboring Laos, where a secret war unfolded that would remain hidden from the American public for years. The agency recruited and trained Hmong tribesmen under the leadership of General Vang Pao, building a guerrilla army that fought Communist Pathet Lao forces and interdicted North Vietnamese supply lines along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The operation, eventually numbering tens of thousands of fighters, became the largest paramilitary campaign in CIA history. Agency-owned Air America flew support missions, delivering supplies to remote outposts and evacuating wounded fighters. The war in Laos was entirely a CIA show, conducted without congressional oversight or public knowledge, an example of how far the agency had strayed from its original intelligence mandate. Meanwhile, in South Vietnam, the CIA developed programs that would later haunt America's moral conscience. The most notorious was Phoenix, a counter-insurgency program initiated in 1967 aimed at destroying the Viet Cong's political infrastructure. Phoenix operatives, a mix of CIA officers, U.S. military personnel, and South Vietnamese forces, identified and neutralized suspected Viet Cong sympathizers, a euphemism that encompassed capture, imprisonment, and often assassination. The program's defenders argued it was effective counterinsurgency. Its critics called it systematic murder. By the program's end in 1972, Phoenix had neutralized over 80,000 people, many of them civilians whose only crime was living in contested villages or being denounced by neighbors, settling personal scores. The CIA also became entangled in the drug trade that flourished in the Golden Triangle, region where Burma, Laos, and Thailand met. Hmong fighters the agency supported often funded their operations through opium cultivation. Air America aircraft, while primarily conducting legitimate military support missions, were sometimes used to transport opium, either with tacit agency approval or through the entrepreneurship of individual pilots. The CIA would later deny systematic involvement in drug trafficking, but the reality was more complex. The agency prioritized its military and political objectives over drug interdiction, looking the other way when allies engaged in narcotics trade. This moral compromise would establish patterns repeated in later operations in Central America and Afghanistan. Perhaps most significantly, the CIA's intelligence analysis on Vietnam demonstrated the agency's vulnerability to political pressure. Throughout the 1960s, the agency's analysts produced assessments questioning whether the war could be won, warning that bombing campaigns were ineffective, and suggesting that reported progress was illusory. These analyses were often unwelcome in the White House and Pentagon, where optimistic military reports dominated discussion. Under pressure to be team players, some CIA assessments were watered down or ignored. The agency contributed to the credibility gap that opened between official pronouncements of progress and the reality of a stalemated war by the time the last American helicopter lifted off from the roof of the U.S. Embassy. In Saigon in April 1975, the CIA had been involved in Southeast Asia for 2 decades. The agency had recruited armies, conducted secret wars, developed controversial programs, and provided intelligence that was sometimes accurate but often ignored. The cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of CIA-recruited fighters dead, hundreds of American personnel killed, moral compromises that would tarnish the agency's reputation for generations, and ultimately, complete failure. North Vietnam had conquered the South, Laos and Cambodia had fallen to communist forces, and the domino theory that had justified so much sacrifice and moral compromise had proven hollow. Vietnam left, the CIA changed. The confidence that had characterized the agency in the 1950s, the belief that covert operations could shape history without consequences, had been shattered. The agency emerged from Southeast Asia wounded institutionally and morally, facing congressional investigations that would expose secrets carefully guarded for decades. The Phoenix program, the secret war in Laos, the drug connections, the assassinations, all would come under scrutiny in what became known as the Year of Intelligence in 1975. The CIA that emerged from Vietnam was facing a reckoning, a demand for accountability that would reshape the agency and its relationship with American democracy. The shadows in which the agency operated were about to receive unwelcome illumination. There comes a moment in every institution's life when the walls meant to protect its secrets begin to crack, when the shadows that have hidden questionable deeds suddenly flood with unwanted light. For the Central Intelligence Agency, that moment arrived in the mid-1970s, a period of reckoning that would force Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about what had been done in their name. The catalyst was not a foreign enemy, but domestic scandal, beginning with a third-rate burglary at the Watergate Hotel that would metastasize into a constitutional crisis, pulling the CIA into a maelstrom of investigation, revelation, and reform that would forever alter the agency's relationship with American democracy. The Watergate break-in of June 1972 initially seemed to have little connection to the CIA. 5 men were arrested burglarizing the Democratic National Committee headquarters, a political crime that appeared straightforward. But as journalists and investigators pulled at the threads, they discovered that several of the burglars had CIA connections, veterans of the Bay of Pigs invasion, men who had conducted covert operations for the agency. More disturbing, the White House attempted to use the CIA to obstruct the FBI's investigation, with President Nixon's aides asking the agency to claim that national security would be compromised by a full inquiry. The CIA's leadership, to its credit, refused, but the agency's peripheral involvement in Watergate opened doors that would lead to far more damaging revelations. As Nixon's presidency collapsed in 1974, Congress and the media sensed that Watergate might be merely the visible tip of a much larger iceberg of government misconduct. In December 1974, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published a bombshell article in the New York Times revealing that the CIA had conducted massive domestic surveillance operations against American citizens, anti-war activists, civil rights leaders, journalists, in direct violation of the agency's charter, which prohibited domestic operations. The program, codenamed Chaos, had compiled files on over 7,000 Americans and infiltrated anti-war organizations at the direction of the Johnson and Nixon administrations, which suspected foreign communist influence behind domestic dissent. The Hersh article triggered a cascade of investigations. President Gerald Ford, hoping to control the damage, appointed a commission headed by Vice President Nelson Rockefeller to investigate CIA abuses. But Congress, emboldened by Watergate and determined to assert its oversight responsibilities, established its own investigations. In the Senate, Frank Church of Idaho led a select committee that would dig deeper into intelligence community operations than any previous congressional inquiry. In the House, Otis Pike of New York conducted a parallel investigation. What they would uncover over the following year would shock the nation and force a fundamental reconsideration of the proper role of intelligence agencies in a democracy. The Church Committee hearings, as they came to be known, peeled back layer after layer of secrets. Americans learned about MKUltra, the CIA's mind control experiments that had dosed unsuspecting citizens with LSD and other drugs, sometimes with fatal results. One victim, Army scientist Frank Olson, had died after being secretly given LSD, his death initially covered up and attributed to suicide. The program had operated for over 2 decades, testing drugs on prisoners, mental patients, and ordinary citizens without their knowledge or consent, a grotesque violation of medical ethics and human rights conducted in the name of developing interrogation techniques and chemical weapons. The committee revealed assassination plots against foreign leaders: Patrice Lumumba of Congo, Fidel Castro of Cuba, Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, the Diem brothers in South Vietnam. While the Church Committee could not definitively prove CIA responsibility for all these deaths, it established that the agency had planned, facilitated, or supported assassination attempts, often operating under vague authorization that insulated policymakers from direct responsibility. The testimony included bizarre details: poisoned cigars for Castro, toxic handkerchiefs, collaboration with mafia figures to kill the Cuban leader. The revelations transformed the CIA's image from defender of freedom to something darker and more troubling. Domestic surveillance extended far beyond chaos. Operation Shamrock involved the CIA working with telegraph companies to intercept and read millions of private communications. The agency had infiltrated religious organizations, media outlets, and universities, recruiting journalists and professors as informants, and using academic research as cover for operations. Hundreds of unwitting Americans had been surveilled, their privacy invaded not because they posed genuine security threats, but because they exercised their constitutional rights to protest government policy. The impact of these revelations was profound. The mystique that had surrounded the CIA since its creation evaporated, replaced by suspicion and anger. The agency's defenders argued that everything had been done to protect national security during a desperate struggle against communism, that judging Cold War actions by peacetime standards was unfair. But many Americans, already disillusioned by Vietnam and Watergate, concluded that the CIA had become a rogue agency, operating beyond legal constraints and democratic accountability. The response was sweeping reform. Congress established permanent intelligence oversight committees in both houses. Executive Order 11905, later strengthened by Executive Order 12333, banned political assassination and imposed new restrictions on CIA operations. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 created a special court to oversee domestic intelligence gathering. The reforms sought to balance security needs with civil liberties, ensuring that the excesses of the past could not be repeated. For the CIA, the mid-1970s represented an institutional near-death experience. The agency's budget was slashed, its operations scrutinized, its morale shattered. William Colby, the director who had cooperated with congressional investigations, was replaced by George H.W. Bush and then Stansfield Turner, who conducted a Halloween massacre that purged hundreds of covert operations personnel. The agency that emerged from this crucible was chastened, constrained, and uncertain about its future role. The shadows that had protected the CIA for decades had been illuminated, and the agency would have to learn to operate in a world where secrets were harder to keep and actions harder to justify. Yet even as it struggled with this new reality, global events were already creating demands for the CIA's unique capabilities, drawing the agency toward another controversial operation in the mountains of Afghanistan. As the 1970s gave way to a new decade, the Central Intelligence Agency found itself cautiously emerging from the shadow of scandal, seeking redemption through a return to its original Cold War mission. That opportunity arrived on Christmas Eve 1979 when Soviet tanks rolled across the border into Afghanistan, beginning an occupation that would become the Soviet Union's Vietnam. For the CIA, Afghanistan represented a chance to strike back against Soviet expansion, to support freedom fighters resisting communist aggression, and to demonstrate that the agency, despite its recent troubles, remained essential to American security. What unfolded over the next decade would be remembered as one of the CIA's greatest Cold War victories, but also as an operation whose unintended consequences would haunt the United States for generations. The Soviet invasion caught American policymakers by surprise, though in retrospect, the warning signs had been visible. Afghanistan's communist government, installed by coup in 1978, was rapidly losing control to Islamic resistance movements. The Soviets, fearing the collapse of a neighboring communist regime, decided to intervene directly, sending 100,000 troops to stabilize the situation. President Jimmy Carter, his foreign policy already damaged by the Iranian hostage crisis, saw the invasion as a fundamental threat to American interests in the region. Within weeks, the CIA received authorization to begin supplying weapons to the Afghan resistance fighters known as Mujahideen, holy warriors fighting to expel the foreign invaders. The operation, given the cryptonym Cyclone, began modestly but would eventually become the largest and most expensive covert action program in CIA history. The agency worked through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, the ISI, which served as intermediary between the CIA and the Mujahideen commanders. This arrangement provided deniability. The weapons were Soviet-made or untraceable, purchased from Egypt, China, and other sources, so their American origin could be obscured. Initially, the support consisted of aging rifles, ammunition, and medical supplies. The strategy was not necessarily to help the Mujahideen win, but to make the occupation costly for the Soviets, to bleed their military and sap their will. The architect of this strategy was CIA officer Gust Avrakotos, a Greek-American from working-class Pittsburgh who broke the agency's Ivy League mold. Avrakotos understood guerrilla warfare and possessed the bureaucratic cunning to navigate Washington's politics while expanding the operation. Alongside him worked Texas Congressman Charlie Wilson, who used his position on appropriations committees to funnel ever-increasing amounts of money to the Afghan program. Wilson's personal crusade, fueled by his own visits to refugee camps and his relationships with Pakistani officials, helped transform Operation Cyclone from a modest harassment campaign into a full-scale attempt to defeat the Soviet military. The turning point came in 1986, when the CIA decided to provide the Mujahideen with Stinger missiles, shoulder-fired anti-aircraft weapons that could bring down Soviet helicopters and aircraft. This decision was controversial within the government. Some feared that Stingers falling into the wrong hands could threaten civilian aircraft, and their American origin would eliminate any pretense of deniability. But the military situation in Afghanistan was desperate, and Soviet air power was devastating Mujahideen formations. The Stingers proved decisive. Afghan fighters, quickly trained by CIA advisors, began shooting down Soviet aircraft with alarming frequency. The psychological impact was profound. Soviet pilots who had operated with impunity suddenly faced deadly threats, and the Mujahideen, previously demoralized by air attacks, gained new confidence. By the late 1980s, Operation Cyclone's budget exceeded $600 million annually, with Saudi Arabia matching American contributions dollar for dollar. The CIA had helped arm and train tens of thousands of fighters, established supply networks that moved weapons across Pakistani territory into Afghanistan, and provided intelligence support that helped Mujahideen commanders plan operations. The results were undeniable. Soviet casualties mounted, morale collapsed, and the war became increasingly unpopular within the Soviet Union itself. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he recognized the war as unwinnable and began planning withdrawal. By February 1989, the last Soviet troops crossed back over the Amu Darya River, leaving behind a devastated country and a Soviet Union whose military mystique had been shattered. For the CIA, Afghanistan seemed like vindication, proof that covert action could achieve strategic objectives without committing American forces. The agency had helped bring down a superpower, contributed to the Soviet Union's eventual collapse, and restored its reputation after the dark years of the 1970s. But even as CIA officers celebrated, The seeds of future disaster were already germinating in the Afghan mountains and Pakistani training camps. The Mujahideen were not a unified force, but a collection of factions ranging from moderate nationalists to radical Islamists. The CIA, working through Pakistani intelligence, had little control over which commanders received weapons. The ISI, pursuing its own agenda, favored the most radical Islamic groups, believing they would be the most committed fighters and the most useful proxies for Pakistani interests after the war. Among those receiving CIA-supplied weapons and training were commanders linked to Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, a brutal extremist who would spend as much time fighting other Mujahideen as fighting Soviets. More ominously, the Afghan conflict attracted foreign Islamic volunteers from across the Muslim world, men who saw the war against the Soviets as a holy cause. Among them was a wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden, who established support networks for Arab fighters and developed connections with the most radical elements of the Mujahideen. While the CIA did not directly fund or train bin Laden, this remains one of the most persistent myths about the operation, the agency created conditions that allowed such figures to flourish, building infrastructure and networks that would later be turned against the United States. When the Soviets withdrew, American interest in Afghanistan evaporated almost overnight. The CIA closed its programs, leaving the country to descend into civil war among competing Mujahideen factions. The weapons that had flowed so freely during the war, including several hundred Stinger missiles that were never recovered, remained in circulation. The training camps and networks established to fight the Soviets persisted, but their focus shifted. Some of the fighters the CIA had helped equip would join the Taliban. Others would form the nucleus of al-Qaeda. The skills learned fighting a superpower would be turned toward new enemies, including the United States itself. Operation Cyclone stands as perhaps the most complex legacy in CIA history, a brilliant tactical success that helped win the Cold War but created problems that would define the next era of American foreign policy. The agency had achieved its immediate objective but had failed to consider what would come after, leaving a power vacuum and an arsenal of weapons in one of the world's most unstable regions. The victory that seemed so complete in 1989 would come to haunt America on September 11, 2001. As the Berlin Wall crumbled in November 1989 and euphoric crowds danced on its ruins, a very different mood prevailed in the corridors of CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. The agency had spent 4 decades focused on a single overarching mission, containing and countering the Soviet Union. Every budget justification, every recruitment pitch, every operational priority had been framed in terms of the communist threat. Now, with stunning rapidity, that threat was dissolving. The Soviet Union itself would cease to exist by December 1991. The Cold War was over, and the CIA, like a military force suddenly deprived of its primary enemy, found itself facing an existential question: what was its purpose in this new world? The early 1990s brought a period of drift and uncertainty to American intelligence. The peace dividend was in vogue. Politicians across the spectrum argued that with the Soviet collapse, defense and intelligence budgets could be slashed, resources redirected to domestic priorities. The CIA's budget was cut substantially, thousands of personnel were dismissed, and morale plummeted. Stations were closed, operations curtailed, and linguistic and regional expertise painfully built over decades was lost as specialists in Russian affairs retired or were let go. There was talk in some quarters of simply dissolving the CIA or at least reducing it to a shell of its former self. The agency struggled to articulate a new mission in this transformed landscape. Director Robert Gates, a career intelligence officer who had risen through the analytical ranks, attempted to reorient the CIA toward new threats: nuclear proliferation, terrorism, narcotics trafficking, economic espionage. But these threats seemed diffuse compared to the existential danger the Soviet Union had posed. Politicians questioned whether the CIA was necessary to track drug cartels, or whether those resources might be better devoted to law enforcement agencies. The dramatic world historical struggle that had justified the CIA's existence and excused its excesses had ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. The Gulf War of 1991 provided a temporary boost to the agency's reputation. The CIA had tracked Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein's military buildup, provided intelligence that supported the military campaign, and conducted operations that helped coalition forces liberate Kuwait. But the war also exposed troubling intelligence failures. The agency had underestimated Iraqi military capabilities before the invasion of Kuwait and overestimated them afterward. More significantly, the CIA failed to detect the full extent of Iraq's nuclear weapons program, which inspection teams discovered after the war was far more advanced than intelligence assessments had suggested. These failures raised questions about the CIA's analytical capabilities, even as the agency sought to justify its relevance in the post-Cold War world. The Clinton administration brought further uncertainty. President Clinton had little natural affinity for the intelligence community and initially seemed more interested in domestic policy than in global threats. His first CIA director, James Woolsey, famously remarked that while the Soviet dragon had been slain, the United States now faced a jungle full of poisonous snakes, terrorism, proliferation, regional conflicts. It was an apt metaphor, but it also captured the problem. The threats were real but less susceptible to traditional intelligence methods, and none seemed urgent enough to justify the CIA's Cold War-era budgets and authorities. Terrorism began to emerge as a central concern, though the threat was not yet fully understood. The 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the 1998 embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, and the 2000 attack on the USS Cole in Yemen demonstrated that a new kind of enemy was emerging: non-state actors motivated by radical ideology, willing to attack American targets and capable of operating globally. The CIA established a special unit focused on Osama bin Laden and his growing terrorist network, Al-Qaeda. Officers tracked bin Laden's movements, monitored his communications, and developed plans to capture or kill him. Yet throughout the 1990s, counterterrorism remained a secondary priority. The resources devoted to fighting terrorism were modest compared to those allocated during the Cold War to Soviet targets. Part of the problem was structural. The CIA remained oriented towards state-based threats and struggled to adapt to non-state actors who didn't have embassies to infiltrate or military installations to photograph. Intelligence sharing between the CIA and FBI was hobbled by bureaucratic rivalries and legal restrictions. Most fundamentally, policymakers and the public did not perceive terrorism as an existential threat, demanding radical action or significant resources. The agency also faced continuing scandals that damaged its credibility. The revelation that CIA officer Aldrich Ames had been spying for the Soviets and later the Russians for nearly a decade, betraying dozens of agents and causing their deaths, exposed devastating security failures. The Guatemala human rights scandal revealed CIA relationships with military officers responsible for massacres. Each revelation brought new rounds of congressional hearings, media criticism, and institutional soul-searching. By the end of the 1990s, the CIA was an organization adrift. It had shrunk significantly from its Cold War peak, lost much of its mystique, and struggled to define its role in a world that seemed, at least on the surface, safer than at any time in living memory. The American public, enjoying the prosperity of the tech boom, had little interest in distant conflicts or abstract threats. Intelligence budgets remained constrained, recruitment suffered, and the expertise needed to penetrate hard targets like Al-Qaeda was lacking. The agency that had once seen itself as the cutting edge of America's defense had become almost an afterthought in national security discussions. Then came the morning of September 11, 2001, as hijacked aircraft struck the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Everything changed. The attacks exposed catastrophic intelligence failures. The CIA had possessed pieces of information about the plot, but failed to connect them or share them effectively with other agencies. Yet the attacks also created an immediate demand for exactly the capabilities the CIA possessed. Suddenly, counterterrorism became the overriding priority, resources flowed freely, and restrictions that had accumulated during the 1990s were swept away. The CIA, which had spent a decade searching for purpose, found itself thrust to the center of a new kind of war. The age of the war on terror had begun, and the agency would emerge from its post-Cold War malaise transformed once again, given powers that would have been unthinkable just days before, and facing moral dilemmas that would echo those of its darkest Cold War days. The morning of September 11, 2001, began like countless others at CIA headquarters in Langley, with analysts arriving for work, officers checking cables from overseas stations, and the daily rhythm of intelligence work proceeding in comfortable routine. Then the first plane struck the World Trade Center, followed 17 minutes later by the second, and within hours, the Central Intelligence Agency found itself at the epicenter of a transformed world. The attacks that killed nearly 3,000 people represented the most catastrophic intelligence failure in American history. Yet paradoxically, they also triggered the agency's most dramatic expansion since the early Cold War, ushering in an era that would see the CIA granted powers its founders could scarcely have imagined, and plunged into moral controversies that rivaled anything from its darkest past. The immediate aftermath brought both condemnation and empowerment. The attacks exposed glaring failures in intelligence collection and sharing. The CIA had known that 2 hijackers were in the United States, but failed to notify the FBI. Various pieces of information that might have exposed the plot sat in different databases, never connected. The agency's penetration of Al-Qaeda remained limited despite years of effort. Director George Tenet would later famously tell the 9/11 Commission that the system was blinking red with warnings before the attacks. Yet those warnings never coalesced into actionable intelligence that might have prevented the catastrophe. Yet even as investigations catalogued these failures, the Bush administration turned to the CIA as the primary weapon in its response. Within days of the attacks, President Bush signed a classified directive granting the agency sweeping new authorities. The CIA was authorized to use lethal force against Al-Qaeda, to capture and detain terrorist suspects, and to employ enhanced interrogation techniques that previous administrations would have classified as torture. The constraints imposed after the Church Committee investigations, the careful oversight established in the 1970s, the restrictions on assassination, all were swept away or reinterpreted in the urgency of the moment. The CIA's first major operation in the war on terror unfolded with remarkable speed. Within weeks of 9/11, agency officers were on the ground in Afghanistan, working with Northern Alliance fighters to overthrow the Taliban regime that had harbored Al-Qaeda. CIA paramilitary teams, working alongside special forces, called in airstrikes, coordinated indigenous forces, and hunted Al-Qaeda leaders in the mountains along the Pakistani border. By December 2001, the Taliban had been toppled. Though Osama bin Laden escaped the dragnet at Tora Bora, the operation demonstrated the CIA's capacity for rapid deployment and effective action when given clear objectives and sufficient resources. But other aspects of the CIA's war on terror would prove far more controversial. The agency established a network of secret prisons known as black sites in countries across the globe: Poland, Romania, Thailand, and elsewhere. In these facilities, hidden from legal oversight and public scrutiny, the CIA held and interrogated high-value detainees using techniques that included waterboarding, sleep deprivation, stress positions, and other methods that international law defined as torture. The architects of these programs argued they were necessary to extract information that could prevent future attacks. The CIA's defenders pointed to intelligence gained from these interrogations that they claimed thwarted terrorist plots and saved lives. The truth proved more complex and troubling. Senate investigations years later would reveal that the enhanced interrogation techniques were far more brutal than the CIA had acknowledged, that the intelligence gained was of questionable value, and that the agency had systematically misled policymakers about the program's effectiveness. Innocent people were swept up in the dragnet. The case of Gul Rahman, who froze to death in a CIA black site despite being wrongly detained, became emblematic of a system operating without adequate safeguards. The psychological and physical damage inflicted on detainees, the erosion of America's moral standing, and the propaganda value handed to terrorist organizations, these costs could not be easily measured against any intelligence gained. The CIA also pioneered the use of armed drones for targeted killings, transforming the agency into something unprecedented in its history. Not just an intelligence service or even a covert action arm, but a quasi-military force conducting what amounted to an aerial assassination campaign. Beginning in 2002 and accelerating dramatically under the Obama administration, CIA-operated drones conducted strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and elsewhere, killing terrorist suspects along with, inevitably, civilians caught in the blasts. The drone program existed in a legal grey zone, not quite war, not quite law enforcement, conducted in countries with whom the United States was not formally at war, targeting individuals who had not been charged with crimes or afforded due process. The operation that came to define the CIA's role in the war on terror was the hunt for Osama bin Laden, a manhunt that consumed agency resources for nearly a decade. Through painstaking detective work, analysts at CIA headquarters pieced together fragments of intelligence, phone calls, courier movements, satellite imagery that eventually led to a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. On May 2, 2011, Navy SEALs raided the compound and killed bin Laden. The CIA's intelligence work had made the operation possible, vindicating years of effort and partially redeeming the agency's failure to prevent the 9/11 attacks. Yet by the time bin Laden died, the war on terror had fundamentally transformed the CIA. The agency's budget had more than doubled, its workforce expanded dramatically, and its operational tempo reached levels unprecedented in peacetime. The line between intelligence gathering and warfare had all but disappeared in some theaters. Young officers joining the CIA after 9/11 knew nothing of the constrained post-church committee agency. They had been recruited into an organization empowered to take direct action against threats, unburdened by many of the restrictions that had defined previous eras. This transformation brought new capabilities, but also new dangers. The agency faced continuing revelations about torture, rendition, and civilian casualties from drone strikes. International relationships suffered as foreign governments discovered CIA black sites on their territory or objected to drone strikes. The moral compromises made in the urgency following 9/11 created precedents and institutional cultures that would be difficult to change even as the initial crisis receded. The CIA had reinvented itself yet again, but whether this reinvention represented evolution or deviation from the agency's proper role remained intensely debated. As the war on terror stretched into its second decade, the question became not whether the CIA could operate effectively in this new paradigm, but whether it should and what costs, moral, legal, and strategic, America was paying for the powers granted to its most secret agency. In the quiet contemplation of history, we arrive finally at a present that remains difficult to assess with the clarity that distance provides. The Central Intelligence Agency today stands as one of the most powerful and controversial institutions in American government, operating at the intersection of technology and human intelligence, of democratic values and operational necessity, of transparency and secrecy. To understand what the CIA has become requires reckoning with everything it has been, the triumphs and disasters, the noble intentions and moral compromises, the essential services and inexcusable excesses that have marked its journey from post-war creation to 21st century intelligence colossus. The modern CIA is in many ways unrecognizable. From the organization that began operating from temporary buildings near the National Mall in 1947, its headquarters in Langley, Virginia, houses roughly 21,000 employees, though the exact number remains classified. Its budget, concealed within the larger black budget for intelligence spending, is estimated at over $15 billion annually. The agency operates stations in over 150 countries, conducts operations across every continent, and possesses technological capabilities that would seem like science fiction to its Cold War predecessors. Satellite imagery of extraordinary resolution, cyber operations that can penetrate the most secure networks, biometric databases containing millions of identities, artificial intelligence systems processing vast oceans of data. These are the tools of modern intelligence. Yet for all its technological sophistication, the CIA's fundamental challenges remain remarkably similar to those it has always faced. How does a democracy maintain a secret intelligence service without that service becoming a threat to democratic values? How can operations conducted in darkness be reconciled with accountability and oversight? When does the pursuit of security justify moral compromise, and when does such compromise undermine the very values security is meant to protect? These questions, debated since the agency's founding, remain as urgent and unresolved as ever. The contemporary CIA operates in a threat environment of almost bewildering complexity. Terrorism remains a central concern, though the nature of the threat has evolved from the hierarchical Al-Qaeda of the early 2000s to diffuse networks of radicalized individuals inspired by ISIS and other groups. The agency conducts counter-terrorism operations daily, disrupting plots, tracking suspects, and supporting partner intelligence services around the world. Yet, the singular focus of the post-9/11 years has given way to recognition that other threats demand attention. Great power competition has returned as a primary concern, with China emerging as a strategic rival whose technological advancement, economic power, and authoritarian model challenge American interests globally. The CIA has refocused significant resources on understanding Chinese intentions, penetrating Chinese decision-making, and countering Chinese intelligence operations. Russia, despite its economic weakness, remains a sophisticated adversary, its intelligence services operating with renewed aggression under Putin's leadership. The 2016 Russian interference in the American presidential election demonstrated that intelligence conflicts now extend into cyberspace and information warfare, domains where traditional CIA capabilities must be adapted to new realities. Cyber operations represent perhaps the most significant evolution in intelligence work. The CIA's capabilities in this domain remain among the most classified aspects of its operations, but revelations from whistleblowers and leaks have provided glimpses of an agency deeply engaged in cyber espionage and offensive operations. The agency can penetrate computer networks, steal data, and conduct operations that leave minimal physical trace. Yet these capabilities also create vulnerabilities. When CIA hacking tools were stolen and published by WikiLeaks in 2017, the agency found its methods exposed and its operations compromised. The drone program continues, either with modifications intended to address some of the controversies that surrounded earlier operations. Strikes require higher level approval than in the past, and the CIA has transferred some drone operations to the military. Yet the fundamental questions about targeted killing remain unresolved. The legal framework justifying these operations has never been fully tested in courts, and the long-term strategic consequences, resentment in countries where strikes occur, the normalization of assassination as a tool of statecraft, continue to accumulate. The CIA's analytical mission, sometimes overshadowed by covert operations, remains vital. The President's daily brief continues each morning, distilling global intelligence into assessments meant to inform policy decision. Yet the relationship between intelligence and policymaking has become increasingly fraught. The Iraq War, launched partly on CIA assessments of weapons of mass destruction that proved catastrophically wrong, damaged the agency's credibility and highlighted the dangers of politicized intelligence. More recently, public disputes between CIA assessments and political leaders have raised questions about whether intelligence can maintain its objectivity in an increasingly partisan environment. Oversight remains contentious. Congressional intelligence committees conduct reviews of CIA operations, but their effectiveness is debated. The committees receive classified briefings and approve budgets, yet they often learn of controversial programs only after they are well established. The tension between effective oversight and operational security between democracies' demand for accountability and intelligence's need for secrecy has never been fully resolved. Perhaps most fundamentally, the CIA faces questions about its culture and values. The agency that conducts enhanced interrogations, operates secret prisons, and conducts targeted killings is recognizably different from the organization envisioned in 1947. Some argue this evolution represents necessary adaptation to new threats. Others contend it represents a dangerous departure from American values and legal norms. The agency's defenders point to attacks prevented, terrorists captured, and intelligence gathered that keeps Americans safe. Its critics enumerate the innocents detained, the laws bent or broken, and the damage to America's moral authority in the world. As we look toward an uncertain future, the CIA stands at yet another inflection point. Artificial intelligence promises to revolutionize intelligence analysis while raising new ethical questions. Quantum computing may render current encryption obsolete, transforming both collection and security. The proliferation of surveillance technology to authoritarian regimes creates new challenges for agency operations. Climate change, pandemic threats, and other transnational challenges demand intelligence capabilities but may not fit traditional agency structures. What endures through all these transformations is the fundamental paradox at the CIA's heart: a secret agency in an open society, an undemocratic institution defending democracy, an organization that operates in darkness in service of the light. This paradox has never been resolved and perhaps cannot be. The best we may hope for is that it remains in tension, that neither pole, complete transparency nor absolute secrecy, perfect accountability nor total autonomy, dominates entirely. The CIA's story is America's story, reflected in a darker mirror. It contains our highest aspirations, the defense of freedom, the willingness to sacrifice for others, the courage to confront difficult truths. It also contains our greatest temptations, the arrogance of power, the rationalization of cruelty, the conviction that noble ends justify ignoble means. As the agency moves forward into an increasingly complex and dangerous world, it carries with it this entire legacy of shadows, a burden of history that shapes every operation, informs every decision, and reminds us that in the contest between security and liberty, vigilance must be directed not just at external enemies, but at the guardians themselves. And so the story continues, mostly in silence, in places whose names we will never know, by people whose sacrifices will never be publicly acknowledged. The Central Intelligence Agency remains what it has always been: indispensable and dangerous, necessary and troubling, a reflection of both our best hopes and our darkest fears. How we choose to wield this instrument, what constraints we accept, what values we insist it honor, these choices will shape not just the agency's future, but the future of the democratic experiment it was created to defend.